everyone. It's Sam here. I'm here with Tim and Simon. This is Aimless Ramblings, and I think this is engine number 9. Today we're going to be talking about, broadly speaking, the ethics or interrelated subjects of food. And I think we're off to a start with Tim.
Thank you very much, Sam. So I suppose talking about the ethics of food, one of the first things that leapt to my mind, probably because I am mildly deranged, is cannibalism. So cannibalism exists in most modern societies as a very taboo topic. In fact, it was most famously used in A Modest Proposal, which was an anonymous essay which was published by Jonathan Swift in 1729, as a mechanism of arousing essentially the emotion of disgust. But cannibalism hasn't necessarily always had such a negative connotation in a lot of societies throughout the world, historically speaking. Funerary cannibalism is relatively common throughout a lot of cultures, although it tends to dip off as time goes on. And an example of this is actually quite close to Australia. Funerary cannibalism is quite common, or was quite common at least until the 20th century, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea and Western Papua. But we also see examples of this on Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon burial sites, where examples of butchering and potentially eating on human bones, but then those bones themselves being buried with some level of dignity. And that suggests that the consumption of the flesh isn't merely just a matter of eating, but it's also a matter of ritual. Now, I think it's kind of less important to look at cannibalism in terms of ethics when we're talking about the extremist position where someone has to eat or they will die. Examples of this include times of starvation in northern China, around the Yellow River region, talking about World War II in the Soviet Union. There is so much cannibalism which occurs in Moscow at one point that after the German forces start to be driven back, one of the priorities of the Soviets is the establishment of an anti-cannibalism task force, through to even more modern examples such as the Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, which resulted in a 19-member rugby team, their family and supporters who were on board this plane when it crashed, ended up the survivors consuming those who died in the crash. But I suppose one thing I want to talk about is something that's sort of drawn out in the novel A Brave New World, is what if we start looking at cannibalism in terms of a source of food from an ethical perspective? So I'd like to toss the question to both Sam and Simon. There has been a lot of argument in the recent past as to whether or not things such as organ donation should be opt-in, opt-out because of the concerns of getting access to organs, but also we're talking now about more sustainable sources of food and potentially as a source of food, if we're going to start going to some of these more extreme angles when we talk about people like Peter Singer and ethical meat, if animals can't really consent to their meat being given, would it be possible for us to harvest the meat of people who did consent to their meat being harvested post their death? And I think Simon actually has one of the first comments, so I'll toss to you, Simon.
So the first thing that came to mind when you were discussing like the ethics of eating human beings, and you were discussing how in Neanderthal times there was a lot of cannibalization and that there's several cases of it, I feel like it falls under the same concept of the religious abstaining from eating pork, in the respect that in a lot of cases early on in the piece, it was to preserve eating meats that could actually make you physically sick. And I feel like cannibalism is that sort of extended to a further point where we don't actually know how much of a human we can actually eat without having ill effects. Like we can obviously see in several other kind of mammals, they have slightly different build-ups. We can eat particular parts of the body. However, when it comes specifically to humans, there hasn't been enough significant research into what's actually able to be eaten without, foul effects, be they, protests or be they actual, ODing on particular vitamins. Anyway, what do you think about that, Tim?
So I definitely agree. Actually, when I was talking about that Papua New Guinean cannibalism, there was, I believe, in the second half of the 20th century, a massive outbreak of CJK, which is mad cow disease when it's from consuming cows. But what was happening was in Papua New Guinea, people going back to their villages, they were consuming the flesh of relatives who had died as part of a funerary cannibalism practice. But those who ate aspects of the brain and the central nervous system were then contracting CJK, they would die. And then once again, you'd have a cycle of funerary cannibalism, which would lead to like another explosion of CJK cases. But I definitely think there is an aspect, maybe not necessarily from the taboo, but definitely from the public health side, that may prohibit the consumption of human flesh. I'll pass to Sam, who I think has something to say.
That what you just mentioned then, holy crap, that's grim. But I'm just thinking most people in Western society that die so at end of life, so old people, right? One, they're going to be chewy, but two, you've just got to consider the vast amounts of medication a lot of people end up being on in the end of life, and whether or not that actually remotely suitable for direct consumption. Like if say I eat a person that's been on warfarin, what degree of that am I going to get? If I'm on warfarin anyway, and I eat a person that's been on warfarin, am I just going to bleed out? It's hard to tell. An alternative possibly could be, I'm going to call it recycling, for lack of a better term, instead of the direct consumption of the person. Grind them into a paste, sterilize it to a degree, spray it on the fields for our crops and such. I'm not sure, though, if eating people is the way to get around a consensual way of getting our protein.
Yeah, I suppose. And once again, some echoes there of Soylent Green. Sorry, Simon, you had something to say?
Yeah, as a continuation of what Sam was just mentioning, it was really interesting how he's discussing the warfarin and whatnot. It brought to mind there was a particular article about the amount of like formaldehyde or formaldehyde-like substances that are just in a decomposing body. And obviously, formaldehyde is poisonous, and it's wondering whether that is passed on just on a base level, ignoring all medications. Just humans in the modern day and age have a particular level of, preservative to them. Anyway, that's all I got to say.
Yeah, fair enough. And I mean, we do exist so high up the trophic level that we do accumulate or bioaccumulate a bunch of heavy metals and not necessarily nice things in terms of plastics, etc. Something I think Sam has some experience with, passing to him.
Yeah, more so just a bit of a joke, I guess. The old saying, grave diggers complaining that we don't smell like we used to because we just don't decompose as fast anymore. Preservatives.
Yeah, well, it's certainly some food for thought, but I think that perhaps there are some more complexities to the cannibalism angle. I definitely think that potentially, I don't want to drag us too far off topic because then you start getting into the issues of the ethicality of suicide. But having just been reading The King in Yellow, the very first short story in that collection talks about, although it's not actually a significant part of the story, just sort of a adjunct, the suicide chamber, which is freely available with the decriminalization of suicide and a sort of fictional, semi-utopian, semi-fascist 1920s America. And potentially, if our concerns are about people at end of life being unsuitable sources of organs, then and meat in this case, maybe potentially both people who, if suicide was ethical, was or not so much ethical as decriminalized, could be a source of both meat and organs, but also potentially people who are young who donate their organs after a car crash or who have a unexpected illness and die. Potentially they could be a source if we're concerned about people who have bioaccumulated a mixture of chemicals and medicinal properties over their entire lifetime. Anyway, I think that's probably enough about cannibalism. But I think, Sam, talking about ethics and eating, you had something to mention more specifically about plants.
Yeah, so I started off, I'm not going to lie. To begin with, I thought this would be a funny topic to research. I get all the crackpots of, plants feeling pain because reasonably straight off the bat, plants don't have a brain or established central nervous system, blah, blah. But holy crap, probably, sorry for swearing, probably since about 2002 onwards, the number of papers being published in, not amazing journals, but like impact ratings of 2 or higher. So they're like actual journals, to deal with like plant neurobiology or plant consciousness is actually like mind-boggling. Yeah, I learned something. So straight off the bat, plants talk. So there's chemical or biological signals emitted by plants that give information and allow them to prime themselves either for light or soil conditions or like mechanical damage. So, say a bovine is grazing on me, I release a signal letting people know that bovines are coming. Maybe make your root stock better because you're going to lose all the top end. Or viral bacterial infections. So they've actually shown that if you infect a plant, I think they used tobacco with the tobacco mosaic virus, and the plant releases, I guess, a warning signal as such to the nearby plants that actually start priming their immune system, the type of immune system that plants have at least, to better respond, and they actually were less susceptible to the virus than plants that were outside of hearing range, lack of a better term. Plant neurobiology. It seems as though plants actually have reasonably complex signaling systems set up, be they electrical, or chemical pathways. So, what happens in one part of the plant is actually communicated to the rest of the plant. So they have something that's analogous to a nervous system, which is, I guess, makes sense, because the roots need to know how the leaves are going in terms to act properly. They need to know when to fruit, blah, blah, blah. What else? Plants have been demonstrating memory. So, and it looks as though there are at least two types of memory that plants seem to have so far. One is more linear pathway from reception of signal to propagation of effectors. So stimuli comes in, response comes, and that memory seems to be able to work with like habituation, priming, that kind of thing. So, if a plant continually grows into an area where it gets burnt off, it'll stop growing into that area. So it's learnt that if it does this, it will burn. And then they've also got some really impressive kind of stuff that seems to be like a long-term storage and recall memory system, and it's like based on chemical gradients and the like of this. But yeah, it really seems as though plants can adapt over long-term stress stimuli through this, for lack of a better term, memory. But this led to like my final question, I guess, within myself is nociceptive signals, which is, we have nerves, they send signals to the brain. Is that pain, or is it the neurological response that takes place within the brain to those signals that is pain? So I was having a look at how we used to view animals. So historically, animals were thought machine-like, right? You stimulate them with an external stimuli, it's picked up by a sensor, it then triggers a motor response, and there's like nothing in there beyond the machine. And 1980 vets, they were actually trained to just ignore animal pain entirely because it wasn't thought to be anything more than a motor stimuli. Tim?
Yeah, I think this is particularly interesting, and as you've mentioned, with pain, and particularly over the last, I'd say, 50 years, the recognition of not just sentience in sort of what we rather, I don't know, insultingly call higher order animals such as chimps, etc., but even down to the level of dogs, like this understanding of the phenomenological issue of pain. And I think it's really interesting here because the question I think you're really picking at is there a phenomenological experience of pain in plants? And I suppose in that sense, because like I think if we're talking about a plant or a mold or even a bacteria, there's obviously a chemical or a biochemistry which results in a cybernetic system in the sense that you have a system which is self-correcting and which is adaptive so as to keep itself going. And I suppose from a Darwinian perspective, it's obvious why you end up with a biochemical system which results in sort of a feedback loop so as to correct the organism one way or the other so that it can survive with and adapt into the environment. But from the perspective of ethics and pain, I think that for particularly last 20 years, but I mean, realistically, going all the way back to Jeremy Bentham and the utilitarians, the concern is not whether or not something is sentient, but whether or not it can suffer. And suffering is seen specifically through that lens of phenomenological pain. So not just a biochemical reaction by an organism to avoid destruction and to continue life, but more so, is there a phenomenological experience of pain in the plant? I'll probably throw the question back to you, Sam. Was there anything in your research that saw potentially some sort of enmindment, for lack of a better word, that existed in some of these plants through communication? Because I suppose you could argue for an emergent mind property, if not within the single plant, across numerous plant organisms because of that communicative factor, which is really how the mind emerges within the neurons of the brain.
So yeah, actually, like some really crazy stuff. I've kind of come out of it going, okay, well, maybe we don't actually feel pain, is probably where I would go to, because obviously, like, we can never experience another organism, right? So a child, right? We just assume children actually feel pain. They're infants. They're incapable of communicating pain, but we assume they feel pain. Well, maybe we don't actually feel pain. Maybe pain, what we call it, is the exact same as every other organism feels it, because all we have that we call pain is this dopamine response or opioid response on top of it. But is that just another way of providing extra strength as such to this nociceptive signal anyway? And in terms of plants actually being sentient, I don't know, and I don't think anyone knows, but I heard an example, or read an example, where they were comparing the root structures set up, the way root structures function in plants, to comparable to, say, humans with a computer. So, like, we use a computer as an aid for a cognitive device, right? So calculations we can't do ourselves, we can palm off to the computer and it can do it. And it seems as though that with the rhizomatic bacteria, maybe, that could be wrong. If there's any biologists out there, I'm incredibly sorry. They look as though they may actually be doing reasonably complex computing in their root systems, which, once you have complex computing taking place, is this, like you said, emergent sentience? We don't know. We'll never know. Yeah. Simon?
Yeah, as you were mentioning before about the specifics of pain versus, is it just an experience that we're experiencing versus maybe pain isn't real? It's really interesting to see in a lot of people that have nerve damage and whatnot. They can experience or there's like that particular disease where parts of your body start falling off, but because all the nerves are dead, you don't feel it. So that really harkens back to, as you were discussing, maybe we don't actually feel pain, and it's just we associate, cause effect sort of thing to say that is pain. I feel like I don't really ask questions. I just, further embellish what you guys say. But stay cool. Thanks.
Yeah, really good point, Simon. It could just be, it's a post-fact rationalization taking place in humans that we are calling pain. Tim?
Yeah, and I think you've drawn out there, Sam, one of those really important philosophical issues. For instance, a paper was written by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel in 1974 called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And he talks about how really for humans there has been, and I suppose really intra-species communication, there has been a development where we have learned sociologically to be able to associate with other organisms within the same grouping to understand that they have a mind. And really, that's an assumption. That's a sort of a priori. So, like before anything else, we assume other people have minds, despite the fact that we don't have any access to them. But when we're talking about other animals in particular, we have no ability to access the phenomenological experience of their mind. And I suppose you're right in the sense it's the same with plants. We will never have a true understanding of whether or not the plant itself has a mind. And I suppose that's where the question comes is if we have historically linked ethics in eating purely on phenomenological experience, then we've kind of linked it on, as in the phenomenological experience of pain, we've kind of painted ourselves into a corner because we've got to a point where we don't necessarily have access to this particular thing, and therefore we can't really effectively use it from an empirical standpoint to say whether or not something is or is not ethical.
Yeah, I think you raised an amazing point there, Tim. We may have actually painted ourselves into a corner because I guess if you take it from an evolutionary point of view, there is no reason not to have, if anyone does have this actual concept of pain, then it's only to an evolutionary advantage because all it does is reinforce the signals. So maybe everything suffers pain. What we'll have to do, I guess, is breed a plant we can talk to. Why not? That sounds reasonable to me, you know? A bit Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy-esque with the animal that consents to consumption. But why not? You know, like if we, so far we're alone in the universe, as far as we're aware, so we may as well try our best to make some company down here. I think you're up next, are you, Simon?
Yeah, that would be me. Yeah, so I'm ending off with the wonderful thing of we've discussed, obviously, the ethics of eating humans. We've discussed the ethics of, eating plants. And mine's mainly on the... Weirdly, I'm sitting in this pure spot that I feel like Sam sort of likes to sit in, which is I'm doing empirical, 100% empirical on food. Like how to, from a sociological and from like a self-preservation point, how to eat and why, what kind of food to eat. So first thing I came to mind was like the one that keeps coming up with a lot of vegans is it's this whole entire thing of, the ethical animals. But I'm like, how much actual food do we put into animals to create like the food that we eat as meat? And there was this really interesting finding by it's a Canadian meat board. So this is specifically the Canadian beef producers. And they've popped out this number. I don't know how specific it is, but it was quite shocking when I first read it. And it's this concept of about, you put about 72 pounds of grain per pound of life weight gained. So for each pound of food that you put in there, it's 63 IB of grain you use. And that's like, oh, well, that's, but you've got to realize that there's space and time and water used to just grow that. And then on top of that, there's the use of water that's required, which is affected by, whether it's just a steer, whether it's actually a pregnant cow. That uses up a lot of water as well, which is a numerical. I have it somewhere here. So it's 80 liters per kilogram of edible beef is the number that it drops, which is a lot of water. And in modern day and age where we're trying to, keep an eye on the water we're using, because that's a finite resource, and we're trying to keep an eye on the amount of space we're using for agriculture, it's just not viable long term to be creating so much grain and so much like stuff to create beef. And then obviously there's the good question that people keep on bringing up, which is, well, then where do you get your iron from? But there's a lot of different sources that aren't red meats. I didn't specify whether I didn't go into white meats like fish and chickens, but I did. This is specifically about cows and beef. But yeah, it's just this very interesting balance. Sam, you have something to further discuss this?
I had this conversation with myself reasonably often, and something I've noticed: if you take data from the US or America or say Brazil, you get absolutely abhorrent amounts of stuff going into the production of beef because they primarily feed them all with grain. Whereas if you say feed them chaff or other products, so you say you grow wheat, the stem of the wheat you can feed to cows. It's low quality feedstock, yes, but we as humans can't actually eat that. So there is that balance of you shouldn't just look at the kilograms of grain because it actually could be kilograms of, say, wheat stems. Just extra, because then we're eating the bread that's made from the wheat and also the beef that's grown off the wheat stems. It's far complex. It frustrates me, but adding that out.
Yeah, that's 100% true, 100% true. It's like, measure 27 times, cut once sort of thing. I was just the only one that came up that, actually gave me numerical things. But Tim has something he wants to discuss about this?
Yeah, just to sort of back up both your and Sam's comments here is the complexity of ethical eating. And I think you've attacked it from a really interesting angle because both Sam and I sort of looked at it from sort of this voluntarism idea of how we can get access to meat and him from a sort of phenomenological study, while you've purely gone at it from a sort of utilitarian and empirical sort of standpoint. So I really appreciate that. But what I was going to say is that when we're talking about ethical diet, it's not as simple as, I suppose, going vegan from a utilitarian perspective, because from some perspectives, if we're using cattle, not just as Sam is saying, to eat the chaff, but you can actually incorporate cattle both in terms of manuring and sort of in terms of if you're doing pastoralist stuff and moving them across large areas, you can use them in a regenerative process to actually increase both individual crop yield, but also regenerative process, as long as they're not grazed too intensively for local environs. And on top of that, when we're talking about, for instance, soy is a massively important aspect of vegan agriculture because you need to get that protein. Soybean monoculture, if not used correctly in sort of a crop rotational or a nitrate fixing methodology where you're sort of rotating it with another crop, can actually be pretty harmful, both in terms of just the general things that come with monoculture in terms of lack of resilience to disease, but also they're not great in terms of the overarching soil quality in the long term if that's all you're growing over the area. Back to you, Simon.
Yeah, definitely the monoculture, that kind of element where you've got to weigh up the pros and the cons. And, being me, I obviously decide to cut over my own point because I love it. I was watching Netflix, and there's this cooking show, and they went to, I think it's called Pig Bay or Hog Bay, and it was discussing how they sort of developed like a minor like ecosystem, and this guy only works with oysters, and it was just interesting watching him have to deal with all the other farmers because the oysters are what's filtering the water, and that's his job. But there's also, the effect of, what the person's using on their crops over here, and they, how they, as you were discussing, like, if they if they live with cows in a particular paddock for too long and they overgraze, the soil goes into the thing, and that, affects all the oysters. And it's just like this wondrous balance when it comes to ethical food that you can't just remove a slight element of the thing because you're like, oh, well, it's unethical to do this, but that has like rippling on effects to all the other elements of the ecosystem. Yeah, that was what I was looking for, ecosystem. Yeah, Tim?
Well, I was just saying, Simon, that I think it once again comes back to what Sam was talking about and what I was saying, that with that cybernetic systems issue, where a system is much more complex than what exists on the surface, and the interconnection of all the parts is really what makes the system work and adapt as the environment itself adapts. Unfortunately, though, I think that's all that we have time for today. So once again, Sam, Simon, thank you very much for an awesome episode, and I hope that we see and hear from our listeners again. Thank you very much.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord.